Japanese were shocked by America's Doolittle raid in 1942. The Doolittle raid, America's bold response to Pearl Harbor, the audacity of desperation, April 18, 1942. Tokyo, Japan. The air raid sirens that wailed across Tokyo that spring afternoon shattered an assumption that had held firm for over 600 years. The Japanese home islands were inviolable. Since the Mongol invasion attempts of the 13th century, no foreign military force had successfully attacked the Japanese mainland. Pearl Harbor had happened just 4 months earlier, and the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable across the Pacific. Yet here, in the heart of the empire, American bombs were falling. The raid itself was militarily modest. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers dropped their payloads on Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka before attempting to reach safety in China. Material damage was limited, but the psychological impact reverberated far beyond the explosive force of those bombs. The raid announced that America was far from defeated, that Japanese cities were vulnerable, and that the war would not proceed according to Tokyo's carefully laid plans. This is the story of how desperation bred innovation, how 80 men volunteered for a mission with slim chances of survival, and how a single raid changed the calculus of the Pacific War. After Pearl Harbor, a nation demands action. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had been devastatingly effective. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, 188 aircraft demolished, and 2,403 Americans killed. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with shocking speed. Hong Kong fell on December 25. Manila was captured on January 2, 1942. Singapore, supposedly the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered on February 15 with 80,000 troops. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in early March. American forces in the Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, were retreating to the Bataan Peninsula in what would become a desperate last stand. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced enormous pressure to strike back. The American public, reeling from defeat after defeat, demanded action, any action that would show Japan was not invincible. Military planners scrambled to find options, but the strategic situation was grim. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. American aircraft carriers, which had fortunately been at sea during the attack, represented the Navy's primary striking power, but Japanese-held territory now extended thousands of miles across the Pacific. American land-based bombers lacked the range to reach Japan from any available airfield. The conventional wisdom held that only a carrier-based strike could reach Japan, but carrier aircraft lacked the range and bomb-carrying capacity to do significant damage and still return safely to their ships. It seemed an insoluble problem. Birth of an impossible plan. In January 1942, Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer on Admiral Ernest King's staff, was inspecting Naval Air Station Norfolk when he watched some Army bombers practicing short takeoffs. An audacious idea struck him. What if Army bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier? The concept was revolutionary and seemingly mad. Army bombers were far larger and heavier than any aircraft that had ever launched from a carrier. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, for instance, weighed over 27,000 pounds, fully loaded more than twice the weight of typical carrier aircraft. No one had ever attempted such a launch, and everyone knew it was impossible. But Lowe brought the idea to Admiral King, who saw its potential. King sent Lowe to see Admiral William Halsey, commander of the Pacific Fleet's carriers, who was immediately enthusiastic. The next question was, could it actually be done? King contacted General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, who assigned the problem to Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle. At 45, Doolittle was already a legend in aviation. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, set multiple speed records, pioneered instrument flying, and won races that made him famous nationwide. He had the technical expertise to assess whether the mission was feasible and the reputation to recruit volunteers for what would clearly be an extraordinarily dangerous operation. Doolittle's analysis was characteristically thorough. The B-25 Mitchell was chosen because its twin engines, relatively compact wingspan, and strong landing gear made it the most suitable Army bomber for carrier operations. But most suitable was relative. The B-25 had a wingspan of 67 feet and a loaded weight far beyond anything carriers were designed to handle. Testing the impossible, the first test came on February 2, 1942, at Naval Air Station, Norfolk. Two B-25s, their crews having practiced short-field takeoffs repeatedly, were loaded aboard the USS Hornet. The carrier steamed into the wind and the bombers rolled down the deck. To the amazement of skeptical Navy observers, both aircraft lifted off successfully with several hundred feet of deck to spare. The mission was feasible barely, but it remained extraordinarily dangerous. The bombers would have to launch at maximum range to have any hope of reaching friendly Chinese airfields after the raid. There would be no turning back, no possibility of landing on the carrier. Every crew member would be flying a one-way mission, hoping to reach China before their fuel ran out, then either crash landing or bailing out in darkness over hostile or unknown territory. Moreover, the entire plan depended on the carrier task force reaching launch position undetected. If Japanese forces discovered the approaching carriers, they would be attacked by overwhelmingly superior enemy air and naval power. The Navy's precious carriers, representing America's only offensive capability in the Pacific, could be lost in an attempt to launch Army bombers on a raid that would do limited material damage even if successful. Volunteers for a secret mission, Doolittle returned to his base at Eglin Field, Florida, to recruit crews. He didn't sugarcoat the dangers. He gathered volunteers and told them they were needed for an extremely hazardous, dangerous, and important mission. He couldn't tell them where they would go or what they would do, but he made clear that survival was uncertain. Every man he approached volunteered. The volunteers came from all backgrounds. There was Lieutenant Ted Lawson, who would later write the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo about the raid. Captain Edward York, at 33, was among the oldest pilots. Second Lieutenant Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, was eager to strike back at the Japanese. Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter had joined the Army Air Corps the day after Pearl Harbor. Gunner Sergeant David Thatcher was just 19 years old. They trained relentlessly at Eglin Field throughout February and early March. Short field takeoffs were practiced until they became routine. Crews studied navigation, bombing techniques, and low-altitude flying. They learned about Japanese air defenses and practiced skimming just above the water to avoid radar detection. They didn't know their target, but they could make educated guesses. When maintenance crews began painting dummy gun barrels on the tails of the B-25s, the bombers' actual tail guns had been removed to save weight. The men realized they would be flying over heavily defended territory where the appearance of armament might deter enemy fighters. On March 25, the crews and their aircraft were loaded aboard the USS Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in San Francisco Bay. As the carrier departed on April 2, Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, announced their destination and mission over the ship's intercom. They were going to bomb Japan. Across the Pacific, the Hornet, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, steamed west at high speed. On April 13, the task force rendezvoused with Admiral Halsey's flagship, the carrier USS Enterprise, along with her escorts. The Enterprise would provide air cover for the force, since the Hornet's deck was packed with Army bombers that couldn't be moved below. The combined task force, designated Task Force 16, continued toward Japan, maintaining radio silence. The plan called for launching the B-25s on the morning of April 19 from a position about 400 nautical miles east of Japan. This would give the bombers enough fuel to reach their targets and continue to airfields in China, where nationalist Chinese forces had agreed to prepare landing facilities. The odds were long, but not impossible. The bombers would attack in daylight, hitting military and industrial targets in 6 cities. Then in the confusion, they would fly west at low altitude to avoid detection, cross the East China Sea, and reach friendly territory before their fuel ran out. Chinese forces would help the crews return to Allied lines. That was the plan anyway. As the task force approached the launch point, tension mounted. Intelligence suggested the Japanese had established a picket line of patrol boats about 600–700 miles from Japan to provide early warning of any approaching threat. Task Force 16 hoped to slip through this line undetected in darkness, reaching launch position by dawn. Discovery and improvisation at 3:10 a.m. on April 18, the Enterprise's radar picked up a contact. It was a small vessel about 12,000 yards away, likely a picket boat. The task force turned away, hoping to avoid detection, but at 5:58 a.m., the USS Nashville spotted another picket boat, the Nito Maru. The Japanese vessel was only 20,000 yards away and had clearly seen the American force. The Nashville opened fire, quickly sinking the picket boat, but the damage was done. The Maru had time to radio a warning before being destroyed. The task force was discovered about 650 nautical miles from Japan, 10 hours of steaming, and 250 miles short of the intended launch point. Admiral Halsey faced a critical decision. Every minute of delay brought Japanese bombers closer to his position. He could abort the mission and turn back, or he could launch immediately, knowing the extra 250 miles would exhaust the B-25's fuel reserves, virtually guaranteeing that none would reach the Chinese airfields. Turning back would leave Japan unscathed and American morale crushed. Launching might save the carriers, but would doom the bomber crews to crash landing in darkness over China, if they made it that far. Halsey made his choice. At 8:00 a.m., signal flags on the Enterprise sent the message, "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you." Launch into history, the Hornet turned into the wind. Seas were rough, and the carrier's bow pitched up and down in the swells. Each bomber would need to time its takeoff for the moment when the bow lifted, giving precious extra altitude at the moment of launch. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's B-25 began its takeoff roll. The heavily loaded bomber accelerated down the deck as the ship pitched in the swells. At the end of the deck, as the bow rose, Doolittle pulled back on the controls. The bomber lifted into the air with feet to spare, banked, and headed west toward Japan. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed. Lieutenant Hoover's aircraft lifted off at 8:25, Lieutenant Gray at 8:30. The launches continued through the morning. Despite the rough seas and the fact that these Army pilots had minimal carrier experience, every takeoff was successful. The last B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Farrow, cleared the deck at 9:19 a.m. as the bombers formed up and headed toward Japan, flying just 50 feet above the ocean to avoid detection. Task Force 16 turned east at flank speed, racing to escape the range of Japanese bombers. For Halsey and his men, the mission was complete. For Doolittle and his 80 airmen, it was just beginning. Over Japan, the flight to Japan took about 4 hours. Flying in loose formation just above the wave tops, the bombers navigated by dead reckoning, occasionally rising to check their position. The early launch meant they would reach Japan around noon rather than dusk as planned, giving defenders more time to react, but also providing better visibility for bombing. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Doolittle's lead aircraft made landfall north of Tokyo. In the city below, it was a normal spring Saturday. Some citizens noticed the unusual aircraft but assumed they were Japanese. Air raid drills were conducted regularly, but the sirens remained silent. Japan had not been attacked for 600 years. It was inconceivable. Doolittle's bomber approached the first target, an industrial area in northern Tokyo. At 1:30 p.m., the bombardier released the first bombs. They were incendiaries designed to start fires in the densely packed wooden structures below. The bombs fell away and Doolittle's aircraft banked sharply, heading west. Now the sirens screamed to life. The second wave of bombers followed minutes behind. Captain York targeted Tokyo's industrial waterfront. Lieutenant Hallmark aimed for the Yokosuka Naval Station. Lieutenant Lawson bombed oil storage facilities. The attacks were spread across multiple cities to create maximum confusion and demonstrate that America could strike anywhere in Japan. Japanese defenses, caught completely by surprise, scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Fighters were launched from airfields around Tokyo, but most American bombers were already racing for the coast before the interceptors could find them. A few Japanese fighters managed to spot the low-flying B-25s, but the American speed and low altitude made them difficult targets. Most bombers escaped without damage. The actual material destruction was modest. One bomber hit a hospital by mistake, a tragic error that killed several patients. Industrial facilities were damaged, and fires broke out in several neighborhoods, but these were controlled relatively quickly. No military installations were seriously impaired. The Japanese reported 50 civilians killed and 400 injured, though actual casualties may have been higher or lower. Confusion reigned in the aftermath. But the physical damage was never the point. Escape and survival as the bombers raced west across the East China Sea, the critical question became whether they had enough fuel to reach China. The early launch had cost them 250 miles of range. Tailwinds helped, but fuel gauges dropped steadily toward empty. Doolittle's aircraft crossed the Chinese coast as darkness fell and fuel ran out. Unable to locate the intended airfield in the darkness and worsening weather, Doolittle ordered his crew to bail out. All 5 men parachuted into the night and landed safely, though scattered across the countryside. Chinese civilians and guerrillas found them and helped them evade Japanese patrols that were searching for downed American airmen. 11 of the 16 bombers followed similar patterns. Running out of fuel in darkness over China, the crews bilayed out or crash-landed. Many were injured in the landings. Chinese civilians, farmers, and guerrillas risked their lives to rescue the Americans and hide them from Japanese troops who were searching the area. One bomber made it to the Soviet Union. Captain York, realizing he couldn't reach China on his remaining fuel, turned north and landed at a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok. The Soviets, not wanting to provoke Japan with whom they had a neutrality pact, interned the crew for over a year before helping them escape to Persia. The fates of 2 crews were tragic. Lieutenant Hallmark's crew crash-landed in the ocean near the Chinese coast. 8 men survived the crash, but 1 drowned. The other 7 made it to shore, where they were captured by Japanese forces. Similarly, Lieutenant Farrow's crew bilayed out over Japanese-held territory and was quickly captured. The captured airmen were taken to Shanghai for interrogation, then Tokyo for trial. In a show trial that violated international law, the Japanese accused the raiders of deliberately targeting civilians and sentenced them to death. International pressure led the Japanese to commute most of the sentences, but 3 men, Lieutenants Hallmark and Farrow and Sergeant Spatz, were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. A 4th, Corporal Metter, died in captivity from mistreatment and disease. The other 4 survivors remained prisoners in harsh conditions until the war's end. Impact on the Japanese psyche, the Doolittle raid's success wasn't measured in tons of explosives or factories destroyed. It was measured in assumptions shattered and strategies reconsidered. For the Japanese public, the raid was profoundly shocking. Government propaganda had assured them that the home islands were invulnerable, protected by the combined fleet and the vast Pacific Ocean. American forces were supposedly reeling from defeat after defeat. Yet American bombers had appeared over Tokyo in broad daylight, bombed at will, and escaped. The attack exposed the government's promises as hollow and raised troubling questions about the military's competence. Japanese civil defense officials realized their preparations were woefully inadequate. Air raid drills had been theatrical exercises. Now they became urgent necessities. Cities began implementing blackout procedures, building shelters, and organizing firefighting units. The psychological burden of vulnerability weighed on a nation that had felt secure for centuries. For Japanese military leaders, the raid was humiliating and strategically concerning. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, they could reach the Imperial Palace. The Emperor himself might be at risk. This was intolerable. The raid crystallized a debate that had been ongoing in the Imperial Navy's leadership. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had long advocated for a decisive battle to destroy the American carrier fleet. The Doolittle raid gave urgency to this strategy. The American carriers had to be found and destroyed before they could launch more raids on Japan. This imperative led directly to the Battle of Midway, fought just 7 weeks after the Doolittle raid. Yamamoto devised an elaborate plan to lure the American carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll, where they would be destroyed by superior Japanese forces. The plan was rushed, the preparations inadequate, and American codebreakers had deciphered enough of Japanese communications to anticipate the attack. At Midway, the Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. The Doolittle raid didn't cause Japan to lose Midway, but it contributed to the rushed decision-making and overconfidence that led to that defeat. Japanese strategists, stinging from the embarrassment of April 18, wanted a quick, decisive victory to restore prestige and eliminate the carrier threat. They got a catastrophic defeat instead. The Chinese price, while the raid boosted American morale, it exacted a terrible price from Chinese civilians. The Japanese army, enraged by Chinese assistance to the American airmen, launched a brutal retaliatory campaign called the Zhejiangjiangxi Campaign. Japanese forces swept through the coastal provinces where the raiders had landed, specifically targeting areas where locals had helped the Americans. Entire villages were destroyed. Chinese estimates suggest that as many as 250,000 civilians were killed in the reprisals. Biological warfare agents were used in some areas, spreading cholera and plague. Airfields that might have been used by future American raids were destroyed. The savagery of the Japanese response demonstrated both the regime's brutality and its fear of further American attacks. It also strengthened Chinese resolve to resist. The civilians who died saving American airmen became martyrs to the Allied cause, though their sacrifice is often overlooked in American accounts of the raid. Aftermath and recognition of the 80 raiders, 69 survived to return to American lines with Chinese assistance, often after harrowing journeys through Japanese-occupied territory. The crews were treated as heroes. Most returned to combat duty, flying missions in Europe, North Africa, and later again in the Pacific. Doolittle, who had been certain the raid's failure to reach Chinese airfields would result in his court-martial, was instead awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt. He was promoted 2 ranks from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping colonel entirely. He went on to command air forces in North Africa and Europe, retiring as a lieutenant general. The raid's impact on American morale was profound and immediate. After 5 months of unrelenting bad news, of defeats and retreats and surrenders, Americans finally had a victory to celebrate. It was a small victory, militarily insignificant in many ways, but it proved that America could hit back. The war was not lost. Japan was not invincible. The psychological boost was exactly what Roosevelt had hoped for. War bond sales increased. Enlistment surged. The national mood shifted from shocked despair to determined resolve. Americans began to believe they could win. The enduring legacy the Doolittle raid demonstrated several principles that would characterize the Pacific War. It showed that innovation and audacity could overcome apparent impossibility. It proved that American forces, though less experienced than their Japanese counterparts, could plan and execute complex operations successfully. It revealed that industrial capacity and technological creativity could compensate for numerical disadvantage in the early stages of a conflict. Most fundamentally, it established that the Pacific War would not follow Japanese plans. Tokyo's strategy had called for a short war in which Japan would seize a defensive perimeter, inflict heavy casualties on American forces attempting to penetrate it, and eventually negotiate a settlement that left Japan in control of its conquests. The Doolittle raid announced that America intended to carry the war to Japan itself, no matter the cost or difficulty. The raid's veterans remained close throughout their lives. They held annual reunions and kept alive the memory of their mission and the men who didn't return. As the survivors aged and passed away, the reunions grew smaller. In 2013, the 4 surviving raiders gathered for their final toast, a tradition where they drank from silver goblets engraved with their names to honor fallen comrades. Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, the last surviving raider, died in 2016 at age 94. Today, the Doolittle raid is remembered as one of the most daring operations in military history. It exemplified courage, innovation, and determination in the darkest hours of the war. The mission's success, and there is no question it was a success, despite the material losses came not from firepower or numbers, but from the willingness of 80 men to fly one way into danger because their country needed hope. They delivered that hope, and in doing so, they changed the course of the war.